says good morning, but it's actually afternoon already. Good afternoon. I'd like to say a few words today about the place of Jews and of anti-Semites in the Republican Party in America. The subject is pressing because since October 2023, their rivals, the Democrats, have largely made their peace with the anti-Jewish hatred of the neo-Marxists and Muslim Brotherhood supporters in their party. In fact, the influence of anti-Semites on the American left has become so blatant and so ubiquitous that most of my American Jewish friends have concluded that Jews have no future in the Democratic Party of Zoran Mamdani and Ilhan Omar. And if the Republicans were to go down this same road, it's not clear what would be left of Jewish life in America. Over the past 18 months, the possibility that the Republicans too would embrace anti-Semitism has become all too real, with some of the most influential podcasts on the political right transforming themselves into platforms for relentless anti-Jewish messaging, not just arguing against Israeli policies towards Gaza or Iran, but for the explicit and savage targeting of Jews, Judaism, and Zionism on a regular basis. And so the question has been asked, and it's been asked loudly and combatively by some of you here over the past 6 months, do these shows represent the future of the Republican Party? The Trump administration and its allies have been blindsided by these podcasts and by the Jewish outrage over them. For months, they largely failed to respond. But in recent weeks, the Trump administration has stepped in to impose order. On January 11th, President Trump took the clearest possible stance against anti-Semitism in his political coalition. Asked by the New York Times if he condemns anti-Semitism on the right, he said, certainly. And then he added, I don't think we need them. I don't think we like them. But then on January 16th, President Trump met with Tucker Carlson for lunch at the White House, which also arranged to have Tucker photographed together with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. And finally, on January 19th, Tucker aired a show in which he said some kind things about two Jews sympathetic to the administration, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and myself. And then he concluded by saying, that's why I would never be anti-Semitic. You can't generalize. Now, these events are obviously choreographed to put an end to 6 months of nightmarish infighting on the political right, which makes sense. The Republicans are facing tough midterm elections in November, and they don't want to lose Congress over anti-Semitism. The problem is that by now, not too many Jews are likely to accept Tucker's disavowal of anti-Semitism at face value. Why? Because for the last 18 months, Tucker's interview show has become a circus of aggressive anti-Jewish propaganda. Anti-Semites know that you can tune into Tucker's show if you want to hear that Jews are a demonic force in history, the Jews have a plan to systematically destroy every Christian community in the Middle East, the Jews control the American government, the Jews shot Kennedy, the Jews propped up Winston Churchill financially so he could start an unnecessary war with Hitler, that the Jewish Bible is about revenge and genocide and doesn't teach us to be gracious to one another, that Christians who think Jews are God's chosen people aren't Christians at all, but heretics, and so on. There's much more of this, but you get the picture. These aren't normal political messages disagreeing with other members of the Trump coalition on legitimate policy issues. They're abusive, wild slanders, and their repeated appearance on Tucker's show has persuaded almost every Jew I know that the program's actual purpose is to drive Jews, along with tens of millions of Zionist Christians, out of the Trump coalition and out of the Republican Party. And if that's not anti-Semitism, then what is? For at least 6 months, Jews and Zionist Christians have been saying that Tucker is one of the leading promoters of anti-Semitic propaganda in our time, and that for this reason he shouldn't be treated as a partner in good standing in the Trump coalition. They said this to Charlie Kirk, they said this to Kevin Roberts, and they've been saying it to the Trump administration. So how's this effort to distance Tucker from power and influence in the Republican Party going? Judging by President Trump and Secretary Rubio's photo op with Tucker in the White House 2 weeks ago, I'd say it's been a total failure. How do we explain this defeat? Well, one possibility is that Tucker's just too powerful. No one's going to touch him politically right now. Tucker is an influential supporter of the Republican Party. The Republicans need him to win elections, and that's just the way it's going to be. A second possibility is that Jews and Christian Zionists are just too weak in Republican circles to take him down a notch politically. A lot of people have the idea that Jews are connected all over the place in the Republican Party, but maybe that view is not exactly right. I'll come back to this point in a moment. A third possibility is that Jews and Zionist Christians have plenty of connections in the Republican Party, but that the case against Tucker over the last 6 months just wasn't presented in a way that was professional, serious, and competent enough to be persuasive. Sure, many of you think that Tucker is a leading promoter of anti-Semitism and that the Trump movement should just ditch him. But that's obviously not what President Trump thinks about Tucker, who did extraordinary work building up the Trump movement over his 7 years as host on Fox News. And on top of that, Tucker is a very smart, passionate, and very likable man when you meet him in person. I had lunch with him once, years ago, and I thought he was great. I invited him to NatCon 1, and he gave one of the best speeches that we've ever hosted. And Tucker has been saying, as clear as the day, that he is not an anti-Semite. Now, if you think otherwise, you're going to have to convince people. You have to make your case in a persuasive way to people who don't spend a whole lot of time watching podcasts. Have Tucker's critics done that? Well, if they have, where's the 15-minute explainer video that I could show to my friends on the political right in Washington, which proves this very serious accusation against Tucker? Where's the carefully assembled research with links and dates and timestamps that could convince an impartial public figure who is open to being convinced? Where is it? The answer is there is no such 15-minute explainer video. There is no such serious research. They don't exist because for some reason, there seem to be no Jews or Zionist Christians who think it's their job to produce such things. Or if there are people who think it's their job, they haven't circulated anything of the sort, not to me or to anyone else in Washington who's in a position to do anything with it. This is an extremely high level of incompetence by the entire anti-Semitism industrial complex, some of whose representatives are sitting right here in this room. Maybe some of you think you were persuasively fighting anti-Semitism over the last 6 months, but the unfortunate truth is that you were not. Let's go back to the question of how well-positioned Jews and Zionist Christians are to have a say in the Republican Party today. Right now, the party is divided into 3 wings. First, there's what I'll call the liberal wing of the Republican Party, which is led by figures such as Lindsey Graham, Mike Pompeo, Ted Cruz. This liberal wing once dominated the Republican Party, but since 2016, it's been shrinking. And it's unlikely that a candidate with liberal Republican views would win the support of more than 25% of the party's primary voters today. Second, there's the nationalist wing of the Republican Party, as represented by President Trump, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth. This camp is distinguished from liberal Republicans by its support for industrial policy to restore America's manufacturing capabilities, its outspoken rejection of compromise on immigration issues, and its skepticism of long foreign wars. The nationalist camp today represents the great majority in the Republican Party, with a likely vote share of 65% or even higher in a contested primary. And finally, there's the alt-right, the alternative right, which was mostly a fringe phenomenon until 2023, when big-name public figures Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens moved into this space. Still, it's unlikely that more than 10% of Republican voters would support a presidential candidate with alt-right views. As you know, liberal Republicans are very supportive of Jews, Judaism, and Israel these days. We should thank them for it. Whereas the alt-right is strongly anti-Semitic now. That leaves the nationalist wing, which has been pretty quiet on these issues over the last 6 months, leaving the whole noisy shooting match to be fought out between the liberal wing of the party and the alt-right. So it's been Mark Levin or Ted Cruz, for example, dishing it out and taking it from Tucker Carlson week after week, month after month. However, the struggle for the soul of the Republican Party is not taking place in these overheated, firing squad-style online confrontations between the liberal Republicans and the alt-right. The actual battle over the future of Jews in the Republican Party is taking place where the majority is, within the big nationalist camp at the center of the party. Now, many Jews, including some Israelis, mistake the online fights for political reality. And so you get all these Jews jumping on the bandwagon and amplifying the rhetoric and arguments coming out of the liberal Republican camp. They think that by retweeting Mark Levin, they're somehow fighting anti-Semitism. But they aren't doing anything of the kind. And that's because nationalist Republicans aren't too inclined to trust the arguments and rhetoric of the liberal camp on too many issues, including this one. In fact, most nationalist Republicans still remember how liberals spent 10 years falsely accusing President Trump of anti-Semitism. And so it's not surprising that they find the overheated rhetoric coming out of the liberal camp on the subject of anti-Semitism to be bellicose, alarmist, and unconvincing. For example, most nationalist Republicans don't think America today is anything like 1930s Germany. They don't see any Nazi party in America poised on the threshold of victory. And for that reason, they don't jump to deplore the agitprop of right-wing podcasters the way liberal Republicans would like them to. And when they don't, this drives liberal Republicans, both Jews and non-Jews, to start misbehaving. They start lashing out at nationalists, accusing them of being anti-Semites or protecting Nazis or being Nazis. I've heard all of this with my own ears. It's a disgrace. And if the goal is to persuade Trump's nationalists to build an alliance with Jews on these and other issues, it's also counterproductive. In 1999, I invited Irving Kristol to deliver a public lecture in Jerusalem. His topic was the political stupidity of the Jews. His thesis was that because Jews don't have a living tradition of thinking about political power, we tend to respond to political situations by pronouncing moral judgments, as if pronouncing moral judgments in an agitated way was going to win us friends in high places. What we've seen over the last 6 months is a textbook case of the same political stupidity of the Jews that Kristol described. It's clear who's in charge of the Republican Party. The nationalists are in charge, and they may be in charge for a generation or more. Given this fact, what would Jews and Zionist Christians be doing right now if they were thinking politically and were willing to fight anti-Semitism using political tools? In short, what would Mordecai and Esther do? First, they'd be doing everything they can to understand how nationalist Republicans think, what they care about, what's important to them. Second, they'd be looking for ways in which Jewish interests can be the basis for common ground with nationalist Republicans. Third, they'd be looking for ways to build bridges and friendships and rock-solid mutually beneficial alliances with nationalist Republicans. But that simply is not what's been happening. Mostly what Jews and Zionist Christians have been doing for the past 6 months is sitting outside the nationalist camp, looking in from a distance through the distorting medium of tendentious leaks and conspiracy theories, which certain liberal publications regularly publish with the aim of hurting the Republican Party as much as they can. It's absurd, but a lot of Jewish Republicans and Israeli Likudniks buy into this rubbish. Why? Because it's a lot easier to believe whatever you read in Jewish Insider, allowing yourself to become a tool in the hands of the left, than it is to do the difficult political work of opening doors and building bridges to the American nationalist camp. What would you find if you actually invested the time and effort and opened those doors? Well, mostly, you discover that nationalist Republicans are not anti-Semites, that they're strongly committed to having Jews in their coalition, that they'd like to have a closer relations with the Jewish community, that many of them see Israel as an inspiration and wish America were more like Israel. In short, you discover that most of them are potential friends and allies. And you discover that nearly all of them are mystified as to why so many Jews and Zionist Christians invest so much time and energy attacking them instead of trying to build strong friendships with them. At this point, we know that much of what was done in the name of fighting anti-Semitism in America in the last 50 years was a complete failure. None of it prevented the takeover of the Democratic Party by anti-Jewish movements. None of it appears to be helping in the present battle over the place of Jews in the Republican Party either. But the good news is that the future relationship between nationalist Republicans and Jews hasn't been decided yet, which means we're looking at a truly historic opportunity. The opportunity to build bridges and a potentially solid alliance with the dominant nationalist camp in the Republican Party, which could stand for a generation or more. Finding common ground with nationalist Republicans is the most important thing we could be doing to actually fight anti-Semitism in America. And if we do that well, then maybe we have a shot at pushing anti-Semitism back into the embarrassing irrelevance that it so richly deserves. Thank you.